We'll get started with our panel in just a minute. I'm going to ask a question, and you've alluded to it here, Megan. We could start both in Pennsylvania with the dilemma that we have with where agriculture is done in Pennsylvania. Mostly intensive agriculture is in the southeast. And granted, they have, from what I understand, the soils and the climate and the markets and the sources of feed. But we also have the challenges of that. And we have habitat being converted to housing and things in that area too. But let's look down the line, and what would Pennsylvania look like? What would the world look like if we were actually paying a little more for food, taking some things off the table that need to be, like Matt was talking about, buffers along the streams. If we were getting back our ecosystem services and maintaining our food supply and making more money in the process, how are we going to get there, and can we speed that up? And this is for all three of you.
I think pretty straightforward things, like I mentioned, would be eating less meat, rolling back to biofuel policies. And this is my pet idea that I would love to have happen sometime during my lifetime. But I think if we can reduce the demand and increase efficiency of production, I would love to see a long grass prairie national park in the Midwest. So it's not exactly Pennsylvania per se, but I think it would be amazing to have this whole new ecosystem protected that virtually nobody has ever seen intact.
I think there are certain trends that are happening in the industry that are just, they're mega trends. And, the dairy industry has gone from 350,000 dairy herds in 1980 to now less than 40,000. That trend is not going to turn around. And it's driven by market forces and economics. I think, though, by understanding how do we improve efficiency, how can we, some of the best environmental stewards I know are farmers. Their interest is in handing this farm to the next generation. And so I think it's a matter of, getting everybody on board on some of these other programs that they can initiate. I think we have to always be mindful of adding additional costs and regulatory burden to producers. The biggest thing that pushed dairy producers out was the Milk Safety Act and the bulk tank. That was so we have to realize that sometimes this regulation has a cascade of effects.
This is a tough question, Val, because it goes back to my point about the wicked problem. This is and Megan's point about no silver bullets. This is a complex societal problem. I think some things that would help. One is to look at embracing within kind of the innovation world of agricultural conservation is technologies and efficiencies. One of the best management practices that's being looked at right now for meeting nitrogen and phosphorus reduction goals for Chesapeake Bay is precision feed management in dairy. And a lot of this is done already, but the concept of reducing the amount of nutrients going in the front end is actually going to reduce the amount of nutrients coming out the back end. And there's studies of research that's pretty well established that's can reduce those nutrients in the order of, I think, 20 to 40%. So that's a good example, kind of embracing innovation, but then also the stewardship ethic, I think. If we had held a conference in Hershey a couple years ago, Pennsylvania in Balance, and the whole thought was we kept getting these report cards from EPA in Pennsylvania, and we're red, we're behind, and they're really putting the heat on in the state to meet these water quality goals, particularly in agriculture. So what would it look like to meet our production economic goals for agriculture in a very important industry for the state, but at the same time meet our environmental goals? And I think what we found, we had producers engaged there. Now these were the ones that are already doing a lot of these things, but they have a very proud stewardship ethic, and they feel that stewardship of the land is something, as David just mentioned, that they're passionate about. And the one line that came out of that report that always does stick with me is, if all farmers looked at kind of their their footprint, the land that they're in control of managing, whether it's production of 2,000 acres or 25 acres of a farmette, and they look to manage their production land for improving soil health, if they manage their stream frontage for ecosystem stewardship and health, and if they saw and manage nutrients and particularly manure as a resource, well, we'd be pretty well on our way to meeting these balanced goals when it comes to water quality and economic production for agriculture. So there's a thought.
I have a couple questions I'll combine here. One is, are we headed for another Dust Bowl? And two is, what about nutrients and soil health? But let's broaden that one a little bit. What about pesticides and soil health too? Soil health, if you could define that a bit and talk about what biodiversity we're talking about and what inorganic and organic constituents we're talking about, and how it is enhanced rather than degraded. Maybe Megan, maybe Matt. I don't ask easy questions.
What was the first part of it?
Well, tell us about your concept, just briefly, what soil health is, what a healthy soil looks like, and how we can build healthy soils while we're still producing food.
Yes, and there was the Dust Bowl part in there. So I think healthy soils are biodiverse in terms of the microorganisms. They have a healthy carbon component. They're able to retain nutrients and cycle nutrients without being, quote, leaky systems. We know of various ways in order to build soil health, cover crops for one. So having the soil covered during the winter time helps retain nutrients and also build the carbon, potentially sequester nitrogen in the soil depending on what kind of cover crop that you're using. Minimal tillage systems, so the least disturbance that you can use. This is all under the terminology of conservation agriculture. Trying to crop throughout the year rather than just have one crop and then bare most of the year. I mean, pasture systems and animal systems, we talked about the marginal land, and I totally agree there's tons of land that we should not be plowing up for crops. I'd advocate turning it into maybe natural lands and parks rather than putting a lot of animals on it. But I think if you look at biodiversity, it's way more biodiverse in a pasture than it is in a cornfield, absolutely. Are we moving towards a Dust Bowl? I don't think so. I feel confident in the American regulatory system. I mean, after we had the Dust Bowl was the origination of the USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service and a whole lot of policies put in place in order to prevent that from ever happening again. And so my non-libertarianism says, I trust the government to help prevent another Dust Bowl in the United States.
Okay, Dave, I have a question for you. How are animal welfare issues associated with intensive systems? How are they addressed? And also, what about, side question, what about BST? Bovine somatotroph.
Okay, yeah, there's quite a number of issues there. Well, I think it's very interesting in dairy. It's very, very challenging to make animals milk more. To get cows to make another pound of milk, you have to have a lot of things in place. That animal has to be healthy, want to eat a meal, have a meal in front of it. So this concept that we can push animals to high production is it's really counter to what we really see in the industry. Lame cows don't eat feed, they don't milk. And so I think there's an inborn kind of natural welfare insurance package, if you will, built into the system of high yield farming. I know that's counter to the image that many people have, but when I go to a farm, the first thing I ask is how much milk are your cows making? And if it's a low number, if it's 15,000 pounds of milk per cow per year, I'm concerned about animal welfare. If I go to a herd and it's 28,000, I'm like, boy, this guy's got a lot of management, because I know what it takes to make that a reality. So I think there's that. And your other element, BST. BST was a product that really has kind of moved out of the market, and it moved out because the milk processing industry didn't want to have to handle two forms of BST and non-BST. So it's a technology that is really reduced. I don't think we even have many herds in Pennsylvania on BST anymore. I think it's a technology, though, downstream that we might have to revisit. Countries like China that are trying to meet their milk demands by adding more cows, a product like BST would have worked wonders, because it could have had them meet their milk needs without going to 14 million cows. And so I think, we have to, sometimes, I think, rethink technology and not be afraid of it, but know how to manage it.
This is a question for any of you that want to answer. How can we communicate ecosystem services better to the public, to where, and I'll say it, to where they know what it is and they have an expectation that they're going to get better, and they see a pathway to do it and they're behind it?
I'm sure Megan has some thoughts on this. Mike's in front of me. I'll just kind of share what comes to my mind. I think some of it is getting back to the concept of experiential learning and getting more folks out on the landscape to see the multitude of ecosystem services are provided on farms. So that was a technique we used in our community engagement strategies in watersheds, was to do discovery tours of farms, get the public out. We're talking about largely rural communities where agriculture is interspersed with residential, but there's not a lot of communication and interaction between those types of communities. And just working with the local fire hall to provide the free pancake breakfast to get folks out, and then we're going to go on a tour after breakfast of a local farm and see kind of conservation in action. I think there's also opportunities to use technology and visualization tools. Just had a conversation yesterday with someone in the geography department that's using these high resolution 360 videography to bring riparian zones to your desktop, so you can see what does a riparian wetland look like. When they're out there doing their field sampling, they're taking imagery and they're creating these these videos that everyone can see. So I think there's a combination of getting out there and also taking advantage of technology and communication advances that are at our fingertips these days.
I think those are some great ideas. There's a branding project out of Stanford University that I think is really interesting, where they talk about it as natural capital. And I think when we talk about ecosystem services, we're almost framing it in a way that we're trying to teach people to understand that it's not a benevolence that you're doing for the earth. You're actually protecting something that, in fact, is very valuable to you. You may not actually be paying for it right now because it's always been working. There's always been pollination, there's always been clean water. But in fact, if we were to lose those, there are huge economic consequences to that. And so I think it's part of the interdisciplinary work that we have to do. I think being able to work with an economist to show a policymaker, hey, if we're not cleaning up our water, this is going to be the billions of dollars of problems that it's going to cause. And so I think, along with that, it's tailoring to different audiences, whether it's the policymaker, whether it's, a children's school, whether it's, the gardening club, just understanding and being able to communicate in different ways, which I think underlying that requires the ability to work interdisciplinarily.
What's the time frame for us to get to where the Chesapeake Bay is no longer hypoxic? And if it's not very fast, how are we going to speed it up?
Boy, that's a great question, Val. I'm not the scientist. I'm more of the policy expert, but the TMDL itself actually has a deadline, and it's 2025, and that's like one blink and we're there. Now that doesn't mean that even by that deadline, it doesn't mean that the expectation the EPA has is that it will be non-hypoxic by then. But the thought is that all of the policies, programs, and practice implementation on the ground needs to be in place by then. We're not going to. I'll say right now, we're not going to make that deadline. I don't see how that's even possible. Although it is still a deadline. It's within the TMDL itself. And EPA is requiring all the states to develop kind of their phase 3 of watershed implementation planning right now, which is basically, I equate it to it's halftime, and coaches are meeting with the players, and they're coming up with their halftime strategy, and we better come out and open up the offense in the second half, or we're not. we don't stand any chance of meeting goals. It's probably going to be decades. Even if we were to implement everything by 2025, you're still looking at decades before just kind of the cumulative impacts of the stewardship practices and the lag times associated with the systems are caught up to it. So it's restoring a watershed. I always say it's a lifetime worth of work and then some for the next generation. So it'll be a while. Now we are seeing some signs of improvement, and there are some indicators, some ecological indicators in the bay, like underwater grasses that are starting to increase in acreage. And so there's some good signs that you're starting to see perhaps some of the ecological resiliency of the bay moving into place as the trends of the nutrient contributions are going downward.
I have another question for Dave. For high efficiency dairy farming, how has the lifespan of the cows changed, and how frequently is artificial insemination used?
Well, artificial insemination is used quite a bit. About 70% of our cow breedings in the U.S. are AI. And, of course, that's led us to really great genetic gain. And AI lets you take the selection intensity on the bull side and expose that to a large number of animals. The life longevity in cows, we typically see about a 5 to 6 year time frame, and actually the big risk period for cows is when they calve, and so we don't see that huge of a relationship to production. And so, because every cow has to go through that parturition, and that's where the big risk is. But your typical culling rates are 30-35% on many of your conventional as well as organic herds. Organics might be a little bit less because they'll keep cows a little bit longer.
I'll make a comment, then I'll ask one last question. The comment is that when we're talking about dead zones, we're talking about the severe outcomes of hypoxia. If you back it down a little bit, you're talking about endocrine disruption in fish as a result of hypoxia that's non-lethal. If you back it down a little more, you're looking at nitrate-induced endocrine disruption. And in different places, you're looking at cyanobacterial blooms, which produce neurotoxins and hepatotoxins. So there's lots of different ways to mess up an ecosystem with overloading it with nutrients. Last question, what does community outreach to farming communities look like? How do you get individual farms to take part, and not only to do it on their property, but also to share their message, their successes, their ways of solving problems with others?
I'll take a shot at that. So some of the strategies we've used to some success, I think probably the top fundamental aspect of successful local engagement in an agricultural community is to find leaders that are trusted in that community, and kind of some of the farmers that already are implementing those kind of stewardship practices, willing to be voices within the community to either talk to their neighbors or implement those practices on the farm so that others can see what's going on. So our strategy has been to try to develop a fairly robust cohort locally that would include farmers and agribusiness leaders to engage very locally with the conservation service providers like county conservation districts, local NRCS office staff, those that have been working for a long time and have kind of trusted relationships with the farmer. That's going to be critical in making inroads with other farmers locally who maybe have not engaged in some of the stewardship practices or the many programs that are available to help cost share conservation practices. That can be another challenge that needs to be overcome. I think you need to think innovatively in strategies where some farmers that we work with in Southeast are from plain sect communities, the Amish. They don't readily work with the government funding programs as well. And so there might be a little more hesitant to work with NRCS and sign a contract with USDA, for example. So coming up with some innovative strategies where you might have a nonprofit organization that can kind of be at the head and have certain ag conservation technicians on staff that can work with those non-governmental organizations that can work with that particular group of farmers, and be maybe a pass through with some grant money that can help and be a little more palatable type of relationship for that farmer in terms of getting some of the financial assistance they need to implement practices. So they're just some thoughts that, kind of lessons learned that we've had through our work.
Well, I want to thank everybody for submitting a bunch of good questions for our panel. I want to thank our panel for helping us get a handle on some aspects of One Health once more. And we look forward to seeing you back here at 3:10. Is that right?
We'll push it back 5 minutes.
We'll give you 5 more minutes. Okay,
Yeah.
Sarah, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to all our speakers.